Imagine waking up one morning to find strangers in your field. They aren't thieves in the night. They wear badges, they have paperwork, and they are there to take nearly half your harvest. Not to feed the hungry, not to support a war effort, but simply to throw it away. This was not a dictatorship. This was not the Soviet Union. This was California. This was the United States. And this happened every single year for decades. The year is 2002. Marvin Horne walks through his vineyards in Fresno County, California. The sun is hot. The grapes are drying on the vine, transforming into the golden raisins that have defined this valley since the 1800s. But Horne isn't thinking about the harvest. He's thinking about the trucks. They will come soon. Not buyers, not distributors, government trucks. And they will demand 47% of everything he has grown. To understand why the most powerful nation on earth was stealing dried fruit from its own citizens, you have to go back to the desperation of 1937. The Great Depression had destroyed American agriculture. Farmers were producing more than Americans could buy, prices had collapsed, and rural America was starving in fields of abundance. In response, Congress passed a law that would fundamentally alter the relationship between the federal government and private property. They called it the Agricultural Marketing Agreement Act. It sounded bureaucratic. It sounded harmless. Created monsters. The law allowed the government to control supply. The theory was simple. If farmers grew too much, the government would take the excess, destroy it or store it, and keep prices artificially high. It was economic engineering at its most blunt. And for one crop in particular, this system evolved into something that defies logic, the National Raisin Reserve. Yes, a reserve for raisins, like oil or gold, but wrinklier. Here's how it worked. Every year, the Raisin Administrative Committee, a real government body that sounded like it belonged in a dystopian novel, would decide how much of the crop farmers were allowed to sell. The rest, the government took it for free. Not taxed, not purchased, taken. These confiscated raisins went into warehouses. Some were fed to school children, some were sold to exporters, and millions upon millions of pounds simply rotted. For 65 years, farmers accepted this. They grumbled, they complained, but they complied. The government had convinced them this was the price of stability. Marvin Horne was different. Horne wasn't a revolutionary. He was a 70-year-old grandfather who had been farming these same Fresno fields since he was a boy. He knew every vine. He knew the laborers by name. And in 2002, he decided he had had enough. When the government trucks arrived for their 47%, Horne stood in the driveway and said no. The Raisin Administrative Committee was not amused. They fined him $200,000 for the missing raisins. Then they fined him another $480,000 for the crime of not submitting to their inspection. Nearly $700,000 in penalties. For keeping fruit he had grown on land he owned with water he had paid for under a sun that belonged to no committee. But Horne had read something the government hoped farmers had forgotten. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, the Takings Clause. It says clearly that private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. The government argued this wasn't a taking. They called it a condition of entering the market. If you wanted to sell raisins, you had to play by their rules. Horne's lawyers called it what it was. Theft with paperwork. For 12 years, the government refused to back down. They won the first round. Horne appealed. They countersued. The raisin industry watched in terror. If Horne won, the entire price support system might collapse. If he lost, farmers would remain vassals to a bureaucracy that could take their crops on a whim. Finally, in 2015, the Supreme Court agreed to hear the case. The arguments were surreal. The government admitted they took the raisins. They admitted they didn't pay for them. They argued instead that the benefit of higher prices justified the taking. It was a legal theory that would have allowed the government to take almost anything, provided they claimed it was for the greater economic good. Justice Elena Kagan seemed incredulous. Justice Antonin Scalia called the program ridiculous. The courtroom actually laughed at one point when the government's lawyer tried to explain why raisins were different from other property. On June 22, 2015, the court ruled 8-1. Chief Justice Roberts didn't mince words. The government cannot take your personal property without compensation any more than they can take your house or your land. The Raisin Reserve was dead. The fines were erased. The trucks never came back. But the story doesn't end with victory. The government had been holding Horne's confiscated raisins for over a decade. Tens of thousands of pounds of them. After the Supreme Court ruling, the government had to give them back. But raisins are not wine. They do not improve with age. The government returned Marvin Horne's property as a rotted, worthless pile of insect-infested sludge. The compensation he fought for was moldy and inedible. The principle, however, remained intact. The Raisin Administrative Committee still exists. They still meet in offices in California, but they no longer send trucks. The National Raisin Reserve officially ended with that ruling, one of the last vestiges of Depression-era command economics to fall. Marvin Horne died a few years later, not a rich man, not a famous man outside agricultural circles, but a man who proved that the Constitution still applied in the produce aisle. Today, when you walk through a grocery store and see those little boxes of sun-made raisins, you are looking at the end of a secret history. For most of the 20th century, nearly every box sold in America was taxed by an invisible hand. The price you paid was artificially high not because of scarcity, but because the government had destroyed the abundance to maintain that price. It was a system built on waste, on the strange economic theology that destroying wealth creates it. We tell ourselves that such things could only happen in the past, in the desperation of the Depression, when extraordinary measures seemed justified. But the Raisin Reserve survived into the age of smartphone. It survived the moon landing and the internet. It survived while America lectured other nations about free markets. It ended only because one man in Fresno decided to say no, to ask the simple question that bureaucracies fear most: by what right? The raisins in your cupboard are no longer government property waiting to be claimed. They are just food, just dried grapes, but they represent something larger. They represent the boundary between citizen and subject, between property and permission. Marvin Horne saved his raisins. In doing so, he reminded us all that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply to stand in your own driveway and refuse to move.